I lived for 27 years, almost 3 decades, after I got back from the Gulf, not understanding what was wrong with me.
When we set out to make this film, we understood that this was bigger than just veterans. That this certainly and Jason talks about 20 veterans a day dying by suicide. And so that was definitely an inspiration early on in the making of the film. But it did not take long for us as filmmakers to recognize the significance that these individual stories had on our society at large, and that in fact probably most of us have have a loved one or have ourselves been affected by trauma. And so while this is certainly a story about veterans, it's also a story about people. And I give a lot of credit to the VA. Before we started making this film, we did not understand the remarkable work that the VA is doing to combat this issue. And the doctors, the dedication, the research, while it wasn't officially given a title, we know about shell shock until the 90s. What the great strides that the VA has made, it really blew us back.
I really agree with that. I guess first I just wanted to say how appreciative I am of the people who are willing to share their stories and how courageous the veterans were to participate, including you, and what a tremendous difference that makes for people to be willing to put their souls bare and share their stories and help us all learn from it. And I really think the VA has been ahead of the curve in recognizing PTSD as a problem and helping us understand what PTSD is and addressing it, and has taught many of us what the leading ways are of treating PTSD, and that there are approaches that can help and make a difference, and studying what the effects of those treatments can look like, and helping many people in and outside of the VA learn how we can treat this problem.
Thank you both for bailing me out. I appreciate that. We didn't even practice that. They just jumped right in. When I got out of the Army in 1993, I was in the first Gulf War. I spent 6 months in Saudi Arabia. There was not any talk when I got out or when I came home about PTSD. There was no screening before I got out of the military. There was no talk of mental health assistance being available at the VA. There was absolutely none of that. And fast forward 20 years, and when these folks have been coming home since, after they learned a lot since then, and the VA, in my opinion, is to be applauded for the changes. The VA in the military, most specifically. I know with Afghanistan and Iraq that when those folks came back and before they got out of the military, they were all screened for PTSD. They were all educated about PTSD. They knew where to go, what to do. It doesn't mean that they did so, but the help was there and it was made aware. When I got out, there was nothing. I lived for 27 years, almost 3 decades, after I got back from the Gulf, not understanding what was wrong with me, not having the first clue, and not believing for 1 second anytime PTSD came up. I was, to say that I was adamantly opposed to the idea is putting it mildly, because to me that was a weakness. To me that was, it wasn't, like I think at one point Jason's talking about, oh, wow, yeah, I guess that is traumatic when you put it that way. I was there. I know what happened. It wasn't that big of a deal. I have no right to have an issue. I'm proud of my service. Therefore, I can't have this problem. And if it were not for the VA, and frankly, people like you and the entire production crew that have absolutely put this in the spotlight, I cannot believe you got the VA to agree to this. I still am blown away by that. But it's way past time to put this front and center. You know, it's way past time to do everything we can, in my opinion, to make up for what was done to our Vietnam veterans. And I'm going to leave that right there.
So we'll toss it out. Raise your hand, so Mike will come to you.
Thank you for your film. Do you think that the veteran population is easier to treat because they went through something together than civilians who might have had different types of trauma and they were working for a goal, you know, even though Vietnam vets were not treated correctly, but they had a sense of duty?
I'm actually interested in your work. Because I'm a filmmaker, so I can't speak to the larger PTSD community, but maybe you have some thoughts.
I think it's a really interesting question that I haven't thought about before, but I do think that it really, each person's experience and recovery journey is going to be their own. And a lot of it really does, though, depend on people's ability to recognize that they have a problem and that they have a treatable problem that there is treatment for. And perhaps in response to what you're saying, it circles back to what we were just saying about the VA really doing a nice job at now screening and helping people identify if they have a problem. But as the film said, trauma is trauma is trauma. And people who experience trauma need care, and the care doesn't look different depending on where the trauma happened or what kind of trauma it was.
Something just you reminded me that this did come up during filming that's very interesting about PTSD is it's sort of two things that popped into my head. One is that it often it's an invisible wound, right? We've all heard that. So we don't even always know what we're looking at. Are we looking at anxiety? Are we looking at alcoholism? Are we looking at depression? Are we looking at bad parenting, right? Like, are we just judging people? And so sometimes it's hard to identify what's going on. And oftentimes it's not even, and I'm sure you've seen this in your work, doesn't even really come out until many years later. So the trauma happens and it gets suppressed, and people live oftentimes high functioning lives, and then years and years, decades later, everything falls apart. And so I think in that regard, to say that this community over another community is easier to sort of treat, I'm not so sure, because it's such an isolating disease.
I think that's a really good point, and also highlights the way experiences can be triggered of previous experiences. So, for example, I do a lot of work with patients who are becoming new parents, new mothers in OBGYN settings, and that is a time of hope and excitement and determination to become the best people and parents that we can be. And it also often triggers memories of what happened in our own childhoods and brings us back to what it was like when we were parented. And so I think life also brings different experiences that remind us of things that have happened in the past, and that a lot depends on what is happening in your life and how it elicits what may have happened in the past.
You know, I think for me, I think that's a great question. And what's been going through my mind since you were halfway through asking it is that, you know, when I came back from overseas, I mean, the military, if you think about it, although there is a common bond, is kind of and I never thought about it like this, it's kind of a transient community, because we're constantly being shipped all over the place and moved around. You go somewhere for a couple years here, a couple years there. And then when you get out of the military, you're blown to 50 states. 52. How many states do we have now? something like that. But we go back to the corner of the world that we came out of in the first place, and nobody around me had the first clue what I had been through. And with the people that I was deployed with, we didn't talk about our feelings when we were waiting for 5 months or however long it was to get deployed. We didn't talk about being scared or worried or, any of those things. It was, gung ho. That's what we're trained for. That's what we're supposed to do. That's my job. And then when we come home, nobody talks about their feelings. So it's invisible is an understatement. It was invisible to me. I didn't have a clue. So does that make it easier to treat? If you're dealing with trauma victims that experience traumas, and I'm way out of my league on this, but that are still living in the community with the family in which they experienced their trauma, I don't know if that would make them easier to treat, but I know that I was completely and totally isolated. There was no one in my life, including my partner, that had the first idea what was happening inside me. So I don't know if that answers that for you or not, but that's what it stirred in me. Thanks.
Your comments are also making me think about military sexual trauma, which is especially common in women veterans and is not an easy thing to talk about, but a really common form of trauma that happens to people who are serving.
Very true.
The question I have is, people went through wars, World War II, Korean War, but the Vietnam War is the first war that I've heard of this disease. Why haven't I heard about it from other wars?
We just didn't know about it.
It was shell shock, right? We all remember that term. My grandparents used that term.
Mm-hmm. I think it's advancement in medicine, if you will. I mean, the recognition by the medical community that mental health issues are medical issues too, instead of a weakness. We just didn't know what we didn't know. That's my opinion, anyway.
People who came back from World War II, from World War I, came back as heroes,
Exactly.
came back to a united society where nobody was questioning their mission. And then it changed. How much does that contribute to the PTSD as we're now seeing it?
I think I can't even wrap my head around what it must have been like for Vietnam veterans to come home and to be treated the way that they were. It's beyond it angers me still anytime I think about it, and that was a little before my time. I know that when we came home, it was actually what felt to me like overkill, the attention that we received and the gratitude that we received, because I think it was a country trying to make up for Vietnam, and it was the Gulf War that they were able to express that on. Vietnam veterans were treated extra special when they got home from the Gulf War because we had a number that served in both. I remember when I came home, we landed at Travis Air Force Base in California, and we were all very anxious to get off the plane. There was a lot of people out there, family, friends, and we all stood up when the plane landed, and they asked us all to sit back down because they wanted to take a moment and deplane all of the Vietnam era veterans first. That was one of the best moments of my life, and I'd still be sitting there today if they asked me to. They deserved that and so much more. So I think it made an enormous difference, and I think we can't do enough to make up for that. But I know that, and this, I can't compare it, so please understand I'm not comparing my experience to Vietnam veterans, but I know when we came home, how we were treated from the Gulf War, and the gratitude, and just in general how we were treated. And when Iraq and Afghanistan started, all of a sudden we became invisible. In fact, to the point that I have found myself not wanting to tell people that I was in the Gulf because they go, oh, well, that wasn't really a war, was it? Oh, I heard that's nothing. And I'm telling you, at the VA, this is what I hear. And I've really struggled with coming forward with my PTSD and addressing it. And I still, even sitting here watching this film today, I'm looking up going, I have nothing to complain about. I can't possibly have PTSD looking at what these guys went through. So it doesn't go away. This is a constant job for me. I don't know if that makes any sense whatsoever, but it's a very real thing. That's an excellent question. Sorry to go on forever.
I thought it was a great film. It was very revealing and educational, informative, and really moving, as well as hopeful. I wonder how many VAs are doing this, for one, but I can't help but think, aren't we training people still to kill in wars? I mean, what are we doing with our military? And I mean, how do you prepare people to fight and feel? I mean, we can all agree war is awful. It does the worst things to all of us. And I can't imagine there's any preventive way unless people were encouraged through the process to be talking more about how hard it is in the midst of it and find support from each other. But even then, never having had to face being drafted or whatever, I don't know what it would be like to be taught to kill people, your enemy, whoever they are.
I think that's a really moving comment, and how can we expect people not to experience repercussions from being asked to do impossible things, right? Like, that's going to affect us, and we are shaped by the experiences that we have. We also know that people who go into the military or go into experiences with histories of trauma are more likely to be re-traumatized again and to have worse symptoms as an outcome. So it becomes a magnifying effect too, that some of the most vulnerable people end up being re-exposed and re-traumatized and having more invasive symptoms.
One thing I will say, though, is that to that point, which was something that we spent a lot of time exploring making the film, which is this idea that if you're traumatized in early childhood, that you tend to be more susceptible to PTSD later in life if you are experiencing trauma. The work you said, you wonder how many VAs. I don't know the number, but I can tell you that in the research of making the film, we were blown away by how many VAs are making this a priority and working together and collaborating, and doctors nationwide have made a very tight-knit community, and they're sharing information. And so I will say that perhaps, and I don't know this there's no facts here, but perhaps people who would have never been exposed to this kind of medical care are now getting remarkable treatment. So maybe that's something that we can feel good about.
I heard something else being asked, though, which I think, is there something that ought to be done as part of basic training, as basically primary prevention? And is anything being done?
I was actually just going to address that because I did hear that in your remark as well. Honestly, I think the training that I personally received, and I'm assuming it's pretty much still the same. I mean, my father went through Paris Island 100 years ago, and, it wasn't too different then either. In order to do what we do, we have to be trained a certain way. It's just, again, this is me and my experience. I had to be able to turn it off to go over and do what I did. I had to be able to not curl up in a ball and show and feel and experience the terror that I felt getting on that airplane. I had a job to do, just like everybody back here had a job to do during that time. It's just what we all did, and my job just happened to be in the military. Where the change, in my opinion, needs to happen, and it's happening dramatically, is through the VA, is through education. It's happening. And, just the film, this right here, this is a huge step. And did I mention that I can't believe the VA let you do this? I mean, it's truly, I mean, this is the kind of thing that the VA swept under the rug years ago. Look at our Vietnam veterans. It's not how I was trained to go to war. It's how I was not trained to come home that was the problem.
How did you get permission to make this film?
So, I mean, I think it's a combination of things. I think that we, as a filmmaking team, showed up with genuine intention, and Dr. Chard felt that. It was also over many months of relationship building before we even got on an airplane and flew to Cincinnati and had a meeting without cameras with Dr. Chard. We had been making the film prior to Cincinnati for 3 years. So this wasn't our first phone call. We were all very, very deeply immersed in the topic and had read a lot of literature. And so I think she felt like she could trust us, honestly. And it didn't happen overnight. And then I think also she has a lot of confidence in her program. And she felt secure knowing that there was no other way to tell the story of what the work they're doing in that specific building is, because they're only doing great work with good intention.
I think that definitely says it, and I do have to say that these amazing people were incredibly respectful of our privacy and of what we were and were not okay with. We were handled with kid gloves. There was not a single gotcha moment up there. We all knew exactly what was going on, and I will, that the trust, it definitely goes both ways, but that's one thing I definitely can say is I absolutely trusted this crew, and we were not wrong in doing so.
Thank you very much. I found it really interesting, and I have two short questions. The first one is, if you could just really briefly explain the biology of the brain and what happens with PTSD, I would find that helpful. The other piece is, does that same biology work with individuals experiencing some milder PTSD symptoms that are not veterans?
So you're probably all going to look at me for this excellent question, and I'm not the right person to answer it. So as a psychologist, I can't say a lot more than Dr. Chard did about the fact that there are brain changes. I don't know, actually, Larry, if you're able to say more about that or not.
Not a lot more. I mean, I think we got the brief summary that what is happening is that this fight or flight response that all of us have the potential for is just kept wired continually. They cite the amygdala, an area of the brain where this gets particularly turned on. I think there's good evidence for that from PET scans and other neuroimaging studies. And that, the aim of therapy and is very much to try to get this deregulated or re-regulated.
Thank you.
And to your other question, milder, it sounded like you're saying people who are not veterans, who have not experienced the trauma of wartime, whatever that looks like. So what really, I'm not a veteran, and what was very powerful to me about making this film was how I suddenly realized how much trauma we as a people experience and are exposed to and are close to in life. And that can be, people can be traumatized simply by watching the news. And I don't say that lightly. That's an actual, that it's documented that 9/11 happened and people in Spain experienced trauma watching that. So whether it's a loved one dies suddenly or unexpectedly, or there's a million different ways, car accident. So I think that PTSD isn't a mild thing. If you have PTSD, it doesn't matter what you think, and that was so much what the point was in the film. It doesn't matter. Maybe Jason wasn't Vince and wasn't out there, taking apart bombs. It doesn't matter what your experience was. It's how are you affected by it.
And just to finish that too is to always remember that every single one of us in life experiences traumas. Not every single one of us develops PTSD. And that is what's important, is that reaction in the brain that we're talking about. It happens for all of us, but once we settle down from our trauma, it goes back to normal. Those of us that are affected with PTSD or have PTSD, whatever, it just stays there. It's like it's just stuck wide open, like Larry said. So anyway, thanks.
I guess I'd make one more point too, and I think again the film alluded to this, that early trauma, adverse childhood experiences, leaves you at greater risk for developing PTSD as an adult. If we also look at who's in the service now, with the draft no longer there, that we are getting more people of color, we are getting more people with relatively impoverished backgrounds financially. All those things, I think, are probably leaving people at greater risk for this. So we can't sort of forget the social part of this as well as the biologic.
Thank you for coming back to that, because I think it was really important. And I think the other piece of this that's important to acknowledge is that PTSD symptoms start out as being normal reactions to abnormal experiences, and people are just trying to survive when something impossible is happening to them. And then they, for reasons, that may, there are lots of things that we can point to that people don't re-regulate and go back when the immediate trauma may be over, and it's as if they're still experiencing it. And so any one of us would have similar experiences if we were exposed to these kinds of situations.
I have a question about the filmmaking. So the hockey scene, how were you able to film that, in the sense that you have really reproduced how a patient with PTSD can be triggered because of all the noises, the violence maybe in the game, the chaos. So this is more like a hockey field is like a battlefield. But how were you able to predict that it's going to happen, or was it just a random thing during the making of the movie?
So I love that you brought up the hockey scene, because in documentary filmmaking, you have no idea what you're going to film. You never, like, every day brings new gifts and challenges. And with the hockey, this was something that they do in the program. They go and they expose the patients to something that could be triggering. So in this case, it was hockey, but they've done other things as well. And we were just tagging along because we were there for the 2 months. And so we went with no concept of how it would develop. And in fact, that scene, Teresa was not the only person that night that had a panic attack. It was like widespread. And that night we went home as filmmakers. I don't know if you even know this, and we said we can't use this footage. It makes it look like the program doesn't work. We were sort of horrified. Like, what have they done to these poor people? And we were like calling back to the New York office, like, you're not going to believe what happened tonight. It was awful. Everybody was so upset. And then, amazingly, and this is why the program is a successful one, which isn't to say, as we learned in the film, that people leave free of PTSD, but what I mean is it's a successful program and that it's working and people are able to get help, is that the next morning it was addressed in group therapy, in individual therapies, and these women in a safe, supported environment were able to process what happened. So that was that whole scene is a very powerful scene. Because it was very upsetting to watch and film and be part of. I don't want to say it was luck, but it does, in a way, highlight something so difficult, an invisible thing to show. It was like we were always scratching our heads. How do we show what PTSD is? It looks like nothing. And then it happened like that.
I would not go to the National Hockey League looking for sponsorship.
No, definitely not. And I have to add to that from a patient's perspective, being in that environment, the film can't possibly do justice to what that experience was like. It was like rapid gunfire, listening to the puck hitting over and over and over, and bodies crashing into it, and we were right there. And I don't think any of us expected that. That was the worst panic attack I've had in my life. I'm one of the ones she's talking about that, I mean, I had to get up and leave, and I didn't understand what was happening. And I appreciated the fact that they took one look at me with the camera and went, not now. I'm like, definitely not now. I understand why they did that. I personally thought, to be honest, that it was a little bit over the top. I don't know how else to put that, but I wouldn't make that decision with veterans in PTSD treatment. It was pretty unbelievable. They did process it well the next day, but it was I think it threw off the whole schedule the following day because the counselors were all trying to glue us back together. I'm sure it had its place, but it was a rough evening. I don't like hockey anymore, by the way. Never really did.
One of the things I found really moving about watching this that I think you did an amazing job of highlighting in the documentary is the support the women showed for each other through that too, and that you were taking care of each other and going through it together, and the empathy and connection. So it was, there was the exposure to the terrible experience, and there was the survival of it too, and getting to the other side and helping each other get through it.
Mm-hmm. Definitely very true. It was a community, and we fought like family. To be clear, you can't put 8 women all raw with PTSD cooped up for 2 months together without a little fireworks here and there. But all in all, it was very. It really was an incredibly supportive atmosphere, and that made it a lot easier.
I'll just make a brief comment. The showing the effects on family, I thought was also an important part, and just appreciated that because I don't remember if the VA has special care for the families. I know they do, but I didn't know if it was specific to the PTSD. And for families to understand it and know how to respond is just so important in my mind. Thank you for all of this. So this has been great.
My husband, after I got out of treatment, he started going to families PTSD support group at the VA through the same mental health clinic that I attend still. He went for probably 6 months to a year, something like that. So they're doing better, I think, all the time with that.
And I agree, it was another important part of the documentary to show that PTSD doesn't affect only the individual diagnosed with the PTSD, but everybody who is in their lives too. The children, the partner.
I just wondered about the group, the women. Did they stay in touch? Because I thought that was probably a really powerful thing for women. They have that community that seemed to really benefit them. So I wondered if they stayed in touch. If there was, how long ago was this again? 18, right?
It was January, February of 2019.
19.
January, February, March.
3 years?
I do not. There's one person in particular that I very much so want to reconnect with, and I know that that will be welcome, but in all honesty, I have not stayed in touch. There have been periodic group texts, but they've mostly been initiated by someone with the film crew. I can't speak to the other women, but my understanding has largely been that everybody just kind of went their separate ways. But I think Chloe could probably answer that better.
Well, I think what you just said is that that you were struck by the camaraderie and the support between the women when things got hairy. So because I've thought a lot about this, because it's true that the women aren't in regular contact. Like you would think, wow, these are like now they're lifelong bonds made. I think that actually the bonding is temporary, but it's real. So I don't think that that the support and the friendship that those women had during that 2 months was insincere or inauthentic. I think that it's just that once they get removed, because it is such an unusual, right? They're plucked out of their lives. They come from all over the country, and every single minute of their day is pretty structured and dictated. This is what you're doing, and then this. There's not really any excursions, and so it's almost like a moment in time, and we're all here with this one goal, and then sort of. I would say that because of the filming, the women are probably more in touch than maybe other cohorts.
I would agree with that. I mean, I can't again speak to that, but it's also, as Chloe was talking, I was thinking that latching on to that group of people going forward would almost be like having a hand in the past because of the nature of what we were there to do. And again, that's not something I've ever really thought about, but in order to move on, I don't need those memories, if that makes any sense. And you can't make your memories go away, but I don't need to relive how difficult that 2-month period was.
However, we, the filmmakers, are very grateful that the participants of this film are still in pretty regular contact with us. And as things develop and eventually a distribution deal happens, it won't be like we haven't called you in 2 years and guess what, now the film is available on this platform. So that has been work that has continued since the end of filming, where we've made it part of the experiences to stay very connected to everybody who participated.
This is a question from Karen Keenan from the virtual audience. If we make mental health wellness practices a part of education for everyone from an early age, could it help anyone recover from trauma in any form?
It's so funny. I total anecdotal, but I did think, what if in kindergarten we had CPT? While we were making this film, I was like, why don't we, along with math and science and social studies and CPT?
For sure, having good foundations, healthy coping skills, good support helps inoculate us to any difficult situation we go through.
And actually, I have 3 children, and they're all young. And I will say to that point, all of them have a mindfulness class, and they've all learned meditation, and they go to different schools, meditation and other practices to help them kind of get in touch with, how am I feeling right now, and how do I work through this in a productive, healthy way. So I do think that we are heading in that direction.
A silver lining to the pandemic, perhaps, too, that there's more permission for all of us to tend to our mental health personally and with each other.
Watching this and having been part of a healing community, I guess for me, what I saw was the gift of healing in the mutuality of the stories. And that being said, it doesn't need to be said over again. There comes a point where you can carry that beyond that. It becomes part of who you are, that healing. And that's what my interpretation was with what I saw happening. It's transitory, kind of but not really. It stays with you. So thank you for the gift of the story, those stories. That was very powerful, beautiful.
We all look for community, and I think we saw that.
To the filmmaker, where do you go from here with this film? Is this something that, for example, PBS might be interested in showing?
Yeah, so we made the film first and foremost for the military community. And so we really want to make sure that all VAs have access to this, and other mental health care providers, or healthcare providers in general. So that was really, we always said that's the primary audience. And then, as we've all seen, this is not just a story about veterans and that anybody can relate to it. So then what is that next platform? Is it PBS? Is it, what streaming platform where it can be accessed by the largest group of people? So I am, my work, and I'm a producer in the filmmaking process, and I've never actually worked on the back end of a film, outside of continuing to support any project I've done. There are people on our team who are focused on those deals. They tend to be more legal, there's a sales agent, and so there will eventually, in the near future, be a home for this film where anybody can find it, and we will certainly market that.
We should probably wrap up. I can't thank you guys enough for the film, for the discussion, for being here. Bittersweet, this is the last one for this year, and look forward to seeing everybody back next year for what will be year 15 of Real Mind. So thanks all, and thank you all.